The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So I found out earlier this year that this is the 100th anniversary of my Italian grandmother coming over from northern Italy with her parents. She was a little girl. She came on a ship over to Ellis Island in New York, and it's the 100th anniversary. In 1921, she came over. And the family legend is that the family was at a Eucharistic procession over in their little village in Italy when the word came through that they had gotten their visa to come here to the United States. So they went to Genoa, which was the big port city nearby, and my grandmother saw electricity for the very first time, and they got on board a ship called the San Giovanni, and they sailed across the Atlantic, and they came to New York, they came to Ellis Island, and they made a home here. Sort of a classic immigrant story, a nice story. Well, I told that story in a homily some months ago, and Chris, our communication director, put it up on Facebook, as he always does. And a few days later, I got an email from my cousin down in Massachusetts, and he said, I saw that homily, the story you were telling about our grandmother, and I know that I wasn't brought up a Catholic, but I always cherished those values that our grandmother had, and I just had my first child, my first daughter. Could I bring her up and get her baptized? And so he did. He came up from Massachusetts. We baptized him here in the parish, and they tell me now that they watch the Mass on live stream. So if they're watching on live stream, a shout out to them. But I'm very impressed that all this happened. And all I can think of is there is my grandmother and my great-grandparents 100 years ago at a Eucharistic procession in Italy praying for their family as they're coming to America. And maybe part of God's answer to that prayer is that 100 years later, their great-grandson would tell the story so that another great-grandson would hear it, so that their great-great-granddaughter could get baptized. So I say that to you because keep praying. Persevere in your prayer. Prayer is always effective, and God can answer a prayer 100 years later if need be. And I think today especially of prayer of grandparents who pray for their families so faithfully. I know there are grandparents here who pray for your children and your grandchildren. Maybe some of you are a little bit worried about family members that have wandered from the faith. Keep praying for them. God will answer those prayers. And today, Pope Francis has declared this the first World Day of Grandparents and the Elderly. So if you're a grandparent, we'll give you a blessing at the end of Mass today. If you want to admit to being elderly, we'll give you a blessing at the end of Mass today. And tomorrow is the feast day of St. Anne and St. Joachim, the grandparents of Jesus. And they were certainly instrumental in helping Jesus on his journey. They prayed for him and their family. And I think in the back of the Pope's mind is that so many grandparents this past year were not able to visit their grandchildren. Maybe there were elderly in the nursing homes that were isolated, that were unable to receive visitors, and they can be so easily forgotten, and yet we cannot forget them. They are so important. And in his letter for this day, the Pope talks about how important the prayer of grandparents are. He says, "The prayer of the elderly can protect the world, helping it perhaps more effectively than the frenetic activity of many others. Your prayer is a very precious resource, a deep breath that the Church and the world urgently need, that inspires in everyone the serene trust that we will soon come to shore, especially in these times, as we continue to sail in the same boat across the stormy sea of the pandemic." Talking about sailing across stormy seas, I think of my grandmother and her family sailing on the San Giovanni across the stormy Atlantic, and they're looking for that first sight of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor to tell them they've made it to the land that they're looking for. And because it is the 100th anniversary of that trip, I decided to go down to New York last month. I took the train down, and I wanted to go visit Ellis Island. I had never been there before. And so I took the little ferry they have across to the island, and it's a beautiful place of history. It's really incredible. 12 million immigrants came there between 1882 and 1954, an average of 5,000 immigrants every single day for over 75 years. And sometimes there's a song about that island. It's called Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears, because you were there for a couple days and they were doing all these health checks and legal checks, and you weren't quite sure if you were going to be let into the country and reunited with your family and your hope would be met, or some people were turned away and they had to go back home, and all of a sudden there was tears. But in those couple days that they were there, they had to get fed. And so there was this huge cafeteria there on Ellis Island in the big building, and they fed 5,000 people every single day. Early on, they sort of exploited some of the immigrants, but later on, they actually did a really nice job taking care of them, feeding them. And I saw the menu. It actually looked pretty good. And many immigrants report that it was the first time they ever tried the great American food of ice cream there at Ellis Island. Well, Jesus might say, well, feeding 5,000, that's nothing. I do that every day myself. Here he is in the gospel feeding 5,000 men, not including women and children, with the bread and the fish that they had. Someone asked me last night, because they noticed, they said, now, it says that the men reclined and that Jesus fed those who reclined. Does that mean he didn't feed the woman? And I had to think about that, and I said, well, my answer was the woman must have been smart enough to bring their own food. It was the men who forgot about it, and they needed to be fed. But Jesus took whatever Philip and Andrew offered him. If they had an ice cream cone, he might have multiplied that, but they didn't. They had bread and fish, all they had. But isn't that great? Jesus can take the little that we have to offer, even if it doesn't seem like it's enough. Even if it doesn't seem like our prayers and our efforts are going to amount to anything, just give it to God anyways, and he can take that and make it so much more than we could possibly imagine. Because with Jesus, we always have enough. And the same thing is true here. They have 12 wicker baskets left over. There is more than enough to feed everyone. And you know, in this chapter that we're reading, John chapter 6, and we're going to be reading through it for several weeks, there's actually two miracles that are performed at the beginning of the chapter. First, Jesus travels across the sea, not on a boat, but on foot. He walks across the water in the midst of the storm. This great miracle showing that he can perform miracles with his body. And then he feeds the crowds with the 5,000 with the bread. This great miracle showing that he can perform miracles with bread. And all of this is setting up the still greater miracle of the Eucharist, where Jesus will take bread and turn it into his body, turn it into his flesh, giving us himself as our as our food and our nourishment. And throughout this chapter, this is Jesus' great teaching on the Eucharist, the bread of life discourse. I am the bread of life. Whoever feeds on me will have life. Because when he feeds the 5,000, it triggers a memory in the people, and they say, wait a minute, our ancestors, our immigrant ancestors who came over from Egypt, slavery in Egypt, they wandered through the wilderness to this land. When they were on that journey for 40 years in the wilderness, God fed them. Because every single morning they would get up and there would be this flour-like substance on the ground like the dewfall, and they gathered it up and they made bread, and they didn't know what it was, so they said, what is it? Which in Hebrew is manna. What is it? And they called it manna. And it says in the Bible that manna was so good, it had this faint taste of honey to it, because it was like this foretaste of the land flowing with milk and honey that they were trying to get to. And it was like an ice cream cone. It was sweet. It was good. But the crowd thinks about it, and they say, well, wait a minute. Moses gave us this manna every day. Jesus just fed us. Jesus, you can perform miracles. Maybe you could give us the manna every day and to feed us. And Jesus will say, no. Moses fed your ancestors, your grandparents, the manna in the desert, but they died. I will give you a bread, and if you eat of this bread, you will live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. And that's what we're about to receive right here at Mass, the Eucharist, the bread that becomes Jesus' body. This is our daily bread that nourishes us, that guides us. It's our bread for the journey as we wander through the wilderness of life, as we travel through those stormy seas, trying to get to the promised land one day in heaven. We have our daily bread to nourish us. And I'm sure there are going to be many storms and many hard travels ahead, but the Lord will be with us. And he says the same thing to us that he said to the disciples as he was walking across the water in the midst of that storm. He said, "It is I. Do not be afraid." One of our great saints of the church, St. Don Bosco, who was a priest up in northern Italy, not far from where my grandmother came from, he once had a vision, a dream, and it was a dream of the church, which was like a ship sailing through the waters of history. And if you look at this church, it almost looks like we're inside of a ship if you turn it upside down. And so he saw the church as like this ship, and the Pope is trying to drive the ship through the storms, and there's all these waves battering the ship, and he sees all these enemy ships coming along and firing on the ship of the church, and it looks like for sure this ship is going to sink. There's no way this ship can withstand everything that's being thrown against it. And then all of a sudden, Don Bosco sees these two columns, these two pedestals rising out of the sea to the skies. And it's almost like the Statue of Liberty, like in New York Harbor. And on one of the pedestals was a statue of the Blessed Mother, and there was an inscription that read, "Help of Christians." And then on the other pedestal was a little bit taller, and on top was the sacred host, the bread of the Eucharist, there for adoration. And the inscription there read, "Salvation of believers." And when the ship made it to these two pedestals, all of a sudden the waves were calmed and all the other ships went away and everything was at peace. And I think hidden in that dream somewhere is the secret, the two secrets to what we need to withstand the storms of life. And it's devotion to our Blessed Mother and devotion to Jesus, truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. And we always have those two rocks in our life, those two foundations to guide us, to enlighten us, to help us through that journey. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be reflecting a lot on the Eucharist as we read through John chapter 6. We have the Feast of the Assumption coming up. We'll think about our Blessed Mother. As we reflect on these mysteries, let's put our trust in them, knowing that, yes, there's been a lot of storms. I'm sure there are storms to come. But we place our trust in the Lord, whom even the wind and the sea obey.